The afternoon sun slanted through my kitchen blinds, casting long golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor as I stood at the sink, methodically washing the lunch dishes. The familiar ritual of warm, sudsy water and the gentle clink of ceramic had always calmed my nerves. But today, even this simple task couldn't quiet the anxiety gnawing at my chest. The phone call from my supervisor still echoed in my mind, each word feeling like a small betrayal of the peaceful life I'd worked so hard to build. Outside my window, the suburban street hummed with its usual Tuesday rhythm. Mrs. Chen was tending to her prize-winning roses across the way, their deep crimson blooms catching the light like jewels. The mailman's truck rumbled past, leaving behind the lingering scent of exhaust mixed with the sweet fragrance of blooming jasmine from my own backyard. Everything looked so normal, so untouched by the chaos that had suddenly invaded my world. This incredible story needs to be heard, so please like and subscribe if you want more. Where in the world are you watching? My name is Patricia Hall. I'm 55 years old, and until 3 hours ago, I thought I knew exactly who I could trust in this quiet neighborhood where I've lived for the past 12 years. The house around me told the story of a life carefully built. Family photos clustered on the mantelpiece, well-worn furniture arranged for comfort rather than style, and the persistent aroma of coffee that seemed permanently embedded in the kitchen walls. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, the place where I could retreat after long days at the accounting firm downtown. The call had come just as I was settling down with my afternoon tea. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, had sounded genuinely confused as she explained that someone had been calling the office repeatedly over the past 2 weeks, expressing concern about my erratic behavior at home. The caller claimed to be a worried neighbor who had witnessed me having loud arguments with invisible people in my backyard, pacing frantically around my property at odd hours, and displaying what they described as increasingly unstable conduct. The accusations were so bizarre, so completely removed from my quiet, orderly existence, that I'd actually laughed at first. But Janet's tone grew more serious as she continued. The calls were becoming more frequent, more detailed, and more convincing. Someone was painting a picture of me as a woman on the edge of a breakdown, and they were doing it with enough conviction that my employer was starting to take notice. I dried my hands on the blue checkered towel that had hung by my sink for 5 years, my movements deliberate and slow as I tried to process this new reality. Who would do such a thing? And why? The questions tumbled through my mind as I moved from the kitchen to the living room, where late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains my mother had made for me decades ago. The sound of a car door slamming in my driveway broke through my troubled thoughts. Through the front window, I watched my daughter Rebecca Hall climbing out of her silver Honda, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a long shift at the hospital. At 32, she had inherited my methodical nature, but paired it with a fierce protectiveness that had served her well in her career. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and even from a distance, I could see the concern etched across her features. "Mom?" Rebecca called as she pushed through the front door, her voice carrying that particular note of worry I'd heard countless times during her childhood whenever she sensed something was wrong. The familiar creak of the hardwood floors announced her approach as she kicked off her white sneakers by the door, a habit I'd tried unsuccessfully to break her of for 30 years. Before I could answer, another vehicle pulled up outside. This time, it was my neighbor and closest friend, Carol Martinez, in her well-maintained blue sedan. Carol lived just 3 houses down and had become my unofficial confidant over the years, the kind of friend who showed up with homemade soup when you were sick and remembered your birthday without Facebook reminders. Her gray hair caught the afternoon light as she hurried up my front walkway. Her face wearing the same expression of concern that seemed to be following me everywhere today. The three of us gathered in my living room, the space suddenly feeling smaller with the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. Carol perched on the edge of my favorite armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Rebecca settled beside me on the couch, close enough that I could smell the hospital's antiseptic scent that clung to her uniform. "I heard about the calls," Carol said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the situation more real. "My friend Linda works in your building's reception area. She mentioned that someone's been calling about you, making wild claims." Rebecca's head snapped up, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. "What kind of claims? And who would do something like this?" As I explained Janet's phone call in detail, watching my daughter's expression shift from confusion to anger, I found myself studying Carol's face for any hint of recognition or understanding. She had lived on this street longer than anyone, knew all the neighbors and their peculiarities. If anyone would have insight into who might harbor such malice toward me, it would be Carol. "This doesn't make sense," Rebecca said, running her fingers through her ponytail in frustration. "Mom, you're the most stable person I know. You've had the same routine for years, the same job, the same quiet life. Who would even think to make up stories like this?" I had been asking myself the same question all afternoon, mentally cataloging every interaction I'd had with neighbors over the past months, searching for any sign of animosity or misunderstanding. But my relationships had always been cordial, if not particularly deep. I kept my lawn maintained, my music at reasonable volumes, and my business to myself. "There's more?" I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. Janet said the caller has been very specific. They mentioned details about my daily routine, things only someone who watches my house regularly would know. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that had marked the passage of time in this house for over a decade. Carol shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and I noticed her gaze drift toward the window that faced the street. "We need to figure out who's behind this," Rebecca declared, her nurse's pragmatism taking over. "This kind of harassment could affect your job, your reputation. We can't just wait and hope it stops." Over the next hour, we discussed every neighbor, every possible source of conflict or misunderstanding. The conversation meandered through mundane disputes about property lines and parking spaces, but nothing seemed significant enough to justify such a calculated attack on my character. Carol offered to ask around discreetly to see if anyone had noticed unusual activity or heard gossip that might provide clues. As evening approached and the golden afternoon light faded to the soft purple of twilight, I walked my daughter and Carol to the door. The street was settling into its evening rhythm, porch lights flickering on, and the distant sound of television programs drifting from open windows. Everything appeared peaceful, normal, exactly as it had for all the years I'd called this place home. But as I stood in my doorway, watching Carol walk toward her house 3 doors down, something nagged at the back of my mind. A small inconsistency in her story about how she'd learned of the calls, a moment of hesitation when Rebecca had asked about potential suspects. It was probably nothing, just my overactive imagination trying to find patterns where none existed. I closed the door and locked it, then moved through my evening routine with mechanical precision. But as I prepared for bed, drawing the bedroom curtains against the darkness outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring revelations I wasn't prepared for. The calls to my employer were just the beginning, and somehow I knew that the truth behind them would be far more complicated than a simple case of mistaken identity or neighborhood gossip gone wrong. And that's when the pattern snapped into place. The next morning, I woke with that peculiar clarity that sometimes follows a restless night. The conversation with Rebecca and Carol replayed in fragments as I made coffee, each detail sharper in the morning light. I had 3 days off from the hospital, a scheduled break that now felt like a gift rather than routine time away. I was still in my robe when Rebecca called, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency she used when she'd made a decision about something. "I've been thinking about yesterday," she said without preamble. "Something doesn't sit right with me about this whole situation. Can I come over? I want to look at this from a different angle." An hour later, she sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, her dark hair pulled back in the same no-nonsense ponytail she'd worn since high school. Rebecca had inherited our mother's methodical nature, the kind of person who organized problems into manageable pieces before tackling them systematically. "Let's go through the timeline again," she said, pen poised. "When did Janet first mention these calls?" 2 weeks ago. She said they'd been coming in sporadically over the past month." I refilled my coffee cup, noticing how the familiar ritual steadied my hands. The caller always identifies themselves as a concerned neighbor, but never gives a name. Rebecca made notes, her expression thoughtful. "And Carol told you about this how?" "She said she heard it through the neighborhood network." "You know how information travels around here." But even as I said it, something felt off about that explanation. Carol had been remarkably well informed about details that seemed too specific for casual gossip. "That's what bothers me," Rebecca said, looking up from her notes. "Carol knew about your morning walks, about the specific times you leave for work. She even mentioned something about you talking to yourself in the garden. How would that information spread through a neighborhood network if only one person was making these calls?" The implication hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. Carol had been our neighbor for 8 years. She'd brought casseroles when I was recovering from surgery, had fed my cat during long hospital shifts, had been the kind of steady, reliable presence that makes a neighborhood feel like home. "Maybe the caller has been talking to multiple people?" I suggested, but the explanation sounded weak even to me. Rebecca set down her pen and met my eyes. "Or maybe the caller has been very specific about these details because they're the person observing them firsthand." The possibility settled over me like a chill. I found myself thinking about Carol's reaction yesterday, how she'd seemed more nervous than sympathetic, how her gaze had kept drifting to the window. The small hesitation when Rebecca asked about potential suspects suddenly felt more significant. "But why?" I asked, though part of me was already cataloging small incidents over the past few months. The way Carol always seemed to appear when I was working in my garden, full of questions about my schedule. Her interest in my work stories, particularly the ones about difficult patients or stressful situations. Her tendency to linger in conversations, drawing out details about my daily routine. "I don't know why," Rebecca admitted, "but I think we need to find out for sure before this goes any further." We spent the rest of the morning developing what Rebecca called our verification strategy. It felt strange to be planning surveillance of someone who had sat in my living room just yesterday, offering support and concern. But the alternative was allowing my professional reputation to be systematically undermined by an unknown enemy. The plan was simple enough. Rebecca would visit Carol that afternoon, ostensibly to follow up on neighborhood safety concerns. She'd mention specific, fabricated details about my routine and see if those details appeared in future calls to my workplace. Meanwhile, I would document everything, creating a timeline that might reveal patterns I'd previously missed. As afternoon approached, I found myself pacing my living room, watching through the window as Rebecca walked down the street toward Carol's house. The familiar view of our neighborhood suddenly felt different, as if I were seeing it through a stranger's eyes. Every house held potential observers. Every window could hide someone cataloging my daily movements. Rebecca was gone for nearly 2 hours. When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Well?" I asked as she settled back into the kitchen chair. "She's definitely hiding something," Rebecca said slowly. When I mentioned the fabricated details about your schedule, she was taking mental notes. I could practically see her filing the information away. And when I asked directly if she'd noticed anything unusual about your behavior lately, she became very animated about things that sounded exactly like what your boss described. The confirmation should have provided clarity, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. I still don't understand why. What have I done to her that would make her want to hurt me like this? Rebecca reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. The gesture was so reminiscent of our childhood, when she'd comfort me after neighborhood conflicts or school disappointments, that I felt tears threatening. "Maybe it's not about what you've done," she said gently. "Maybe it's about something else entirely, something we haven't considered." But before I could ask what she meant, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Janet's number, and I felt my stomach drop. It was barely 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, an unusual time for my supervisor to call unless something significant had happened. "Another call came in 20 minutes ago," Janet said without preamble. This time, the person was very specific about an incident they claimed to have witnessed this morning. I set the phone to speaker so Rebecca could hear, my hands trembling slightly as I placed it on the kitchen table between us. "What kind of incident?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "The caller claimed you were outside at 6 this morning, screaming at someone who wasn't there and throwing objects around your yard. They said you appeared to be having some sort of breakdown and that neighbors were concerned for their safety." Rebecca's eyes widened, and she immediately grabbed my arm, shaking her head vigorously. I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking the same thing. At 6 this morning, I had been in my kitchen making coffee, and Rebecca had been here with me. We'd sat at this very table, going over our plan to test Carol. "Janet, that's completely fabricated," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "I was inside my house at 6 this morning. I have a witness. I understand this is difficult, but these calls are becoming more frequent and more detailed. The person today knew specific details about your property, your car, even what you were allegedly wearing." My blood ran cold. What did they say I was wearing? A blue robe and slippers. "They mentioned you have a red Toyota Camry parked in your driveway and that you threw what looked like a coffee mug at your front door." Rebecca leaned forward, her face pale. The description was eerily accurate about my car and the blue robe hanging in my bedroom, details that someone watching my house would know. But I had never thrown anything at my door, and I certainly hadn't been outside screaming at 6 in the morning. "Janet, someone is systematically lying about me, and they're using real details about my property to make the lies seem credible. This isn't about erratic behavior. This is harassment." There was a long pause on the other end. "I want to believe you, but I have to take these reports seriously." The caller sounded very concerned and very credible. They knew details that would be impossible to fabricate unless they had actually witnessed something. Rebecca grabbed a piece of paper and started writing frantically, then held it up to me. "Ask if they left their name this time." "Did the caller leave their name or contact information this time?" I asked. "No, they said they preferred to remain anonymous because they were afraid of retaliation. But they did mention they live very close to you and have been documenting these incidents for several weeks." After I hung up, Rebecca and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The level of detail in the false report was disturbing. suggesting someone who had been watching my house carefully enough to know about my car, and possibly even what I wore around the house. "This is escalating," Rebecca said quietly. "Whoever is doing this isn't just making random complaints anymore. They're crafting detailed false narratives using real information about your life. The description of my robe, my car, even the coffee mug detail. Someone would have to be watching my house very closely to know those things," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. Rebecca stood up abruptly and walked to my front window, peering out at the street. "We confirmed this afternoon that Carol is involved, but now I'm wondering if she's working alone. The level of surveillance this suggests might require more than one person." "What do you mean?" She turned back to me, her expression grim. "Think about it. To know what car you drive, what you wear in the mornings, the layout of your property well enough to describe it convincingly to your boss, someone would need to be watching you regularly. That's a significant time commitment for one person." The implications of what she was suggesting made my stomach churn. "You think multiple people are watching me?" "I think we need to be very careful about who we trust right now," Rebecca said, returning to the table. "The false report today was called in just 20 minutes after I left Carol's house. That timing could be coincidental, or it could mean she immediately called someone after our conversation." Before I could respond, there was a knock at my front door. Through the window, I could see Carol herself standing on my porch, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. Her expression was pleasant, almost cheerful, as if she were simply being neighborly. "She has incredible timing," Rebecca muttered, moving away from the window. "Should I answer it?" I asked, my heart racing. "Yes, but I'm going to listen from the kitchen. Don't mention the phone call from your boss, and don't let on that you suspect anything. Just be normal." I opened the door to find Carol smiling warmly, the same expression she'd worn countless times over the past year when we'd chatted over the fence or passed each other on evening walks. "Hi there," she said brightly. "I made too much tuna casserole and thought you might enjoy some. You've seemed a bit stressed lately, and I know how hard it can be to cook when you're dealing with a lot." The casual reference to my stress level felt loaded now, knowing what I knew. "That's very thoughtful of you, Carol. Thank you." "I hope everything is okay with you," she continued, her voice full of apparent concern. "I've noticed you've had more visitors lately, and sometimes I hear voices from your house at odd hours. I just want you to know that if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." The mention of voices at odd hours made my skin crawl. Rebecca had been staying overnight several times recently, and we had been talking late into the evening about the situation. But how would Carol know that unless she was deliberately listening? "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully. "My sister has been visiting more often lately. Family time, you know." Carol's eyes brightened with what seemed like genuine interest. "Oh, your sister? I don't think I've met her. Is she the one with the dark hair who arrived yesterday afternoon?" The question was clearly meant to seem casual, but it confirmed that Carol was indeed watching my house closely enough to note the timing of Rebecca's visits and her appearance. "Yes, that's Rebecca," I said, wondering if I should invite Carol to meet her and see how she reacted. "Well, please let her know she's welcome in the neighborhood anytime," Carol said, but something in her tone suggested the opposite. "I should let you get back to your evening. Enjoy the casserole." As I closed the door, I realized my hands were shaking again. Rebecca appeared immediately from the kitchen, her expression tense. "Did you hear all of that?" I asked. "Every word. She knows exactly when I arrive, what I look like, and that we've been talking late into the evening. This goes way beyond casual neighborly observation." I set Carol's casserole on the counter, suddenly suspicious of even accepting food from her. "What do we do now?" Now we call Michael, Rebecca said firmly. This has moved beyond neighborhood drama. If Carol is surveilling you this closely and making false reports to your employer, Michael needs to know about it. This could affect the legal aspects of your situation. But as Rebecca reached for her phone to call our brother, mine rang again. This time, it wasn't Janet. It was Michael himself. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Something has happened that changes everything." My stomach dropped at the gravity in Michael's voice. Rebecca moved closer, her expression shifting from concern to alarm as she watched my face. "What's happened?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker so Rebecca could hear. "I got a call about an hour ago," Michael said, his lawyer voice carefully controlled, but tense. "Someone contacted my office claiming to be a concerned neighbor who wanted to know if I was aware of my sister's deteriorating mental state. They said you've been having episodes of paranoid behavior and that your employer had been contacted about your instability." The room seemed to tilt around me. Rebecca's hand found my shoulder, steadying me as I processed what Michael was saying. "Carol called your office?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Michael continued. "The caller didn't identify themselves specifically, just said they were a neighbor who felt obligated to reach out to family. They seemed to know quite a bit about our family dynamics, including that I'm a lawyer and that Rebecca has been staying with you more frequently." I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unsteady. "Michael, this is beyond anything I imagined. She's not just watching me or calling my work. She's actively trying to undermine my relationships with my own family." "Here's the thing," Michael said, his voice taking on the sharp edge I recognized from when he was building a case. "Whoever called made a mistake. They assumed I would be receptive to their concerns about you. Instead, they've just provided me with evidence of harassment that goes far beyond neighborly complaints." Rebecca leaned toward the phone. "Did you record the call?" "I didn't, but I took detailed notes immediately afterward. The caller knew specific details that no casual observer should know. They mentioned that you've been coming to stay overnight multiple times recently, Rebecca. They knew that our parents live out of state and that I handle family legal matters. They even mentioned that our family has been dealing with stress lately." The precision of Carol's knowledge was chilling. "She's been watching everything," I said, my voice barely steady. "Tonight she brought me a casserole and mentioned hearing voices from my house at odd hours, and seeing Rebecca arrive yesterday afternoon. She knew exactly what Rebecca looked like." "This is systematic surveillance," Michael said firmly. "And the fact that she's now contacting your employer and trying to turn family members against you suggests an escalation that we need to take seriously." Rebecca stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "She's trying to isolate you. First your job, now your family. If she could convince Michael that you are having mental health issues, she could potentially undermine any complaint you might make about her behavior." "Except she underestimated Michael," I said, feeling a small spark of gratitude despite my fear. "Exactly," Michael agreed. "And she made another mistake. She gave me information about her surveillance activities. No neighbor should know the kind of details she shared unless they were deliberately monitoring your life." I looked at Carol's casserole sitting on my counter and felt nauseated. "What do we do now? This feels like it's spinning completely out of control." "Now we document everything," Michael said. "I want you to write down every interaction you've had with this neighbor, every complaint she's made, every time she's demonstrated knowledge she shouldn't have. Rebecca, you do the same for anything you've observed." Rebecca turned from the window, her expression determined. "I can stay here indefinitely. If she's watching this closely, having a witness present changes everything." That's exactly what I was going to suggest, Michael said. But we also need to be proactive. Tomorrow I'm going to make some calls. If she's filing false reports about your mental state with your employer and contacting family members with fabricated concerns, that could constitute harassment or defamation. The idea that this situation might have legal ramifications both reassured and terrified me. Will that make things worse? What if she escalates further? She's already escalating, Rebecca pointed out. Going from noise complaints to calling Michael shows she's not planning to stop on her own. Michael's voice was reassuring but serious. The goal isn't necessarily to pursue legal action immediately. It's to create a clear record of her behavior and to let the relevant parties know that her complaints are part of a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate concerns. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the situation. I can't believe this started with her complaining about my morning routine and has turned into her trying to convince my family I'm having a mental breakdown. That's exactly why we need to take this seriously, Michael said. People who engage in this level of surveillance and false reporting rarely stop without intervention. Rebecca sat back down beside me. We're going to figure this out. You're not dealing with this alone anymore. As we talked through the timeline of Carol's behavior, my phone buzzed with a text message. My blood ran cold when I saw it was from Janet at work. It's my supervisor again, I told Michael and Rebecca, my voice barely steady. She's texting me at 9:30 at night. What does it say? Rebecca asked. I read the message aloud, my voice shaking. Need to schedule a meeting first thing Monday morning to discuss the ongoing situation. Please confirm you'll be available at 8 a.m. The silence that followed felt heavy with implication. Michael finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's not done. Whatever Carol told your supervisor today, she's planning something more. The weight of Janet's message settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I stared at the phone screen, reading the words again and again as if they might change. 8 a.m. Monday morning. Less than 36 hours away, and I had no idea what I was walking into. I need to respond to this, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. But I don't know what to say. If I sound too defensive, it might confirm whatever Carol told her. If I act like nothing's wrong, I might seem oblivious or unstable. Michael leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What's your relationship with Janet normally like? Is she someone who jumps to conclusions, or does she usually give you the benefit of the doubt? I tried to think clearly about my supervisor, but my mind felt foggy with anxiety. She's fair, I think. We don't interact much day to day, but she's never been unreasonable. That's what makes this so confusing. For her to text me on a Sunday night about a meeting first thing Monday, whatever Carol said must have been pretty convincing. Rebecca moved closer, her presence grounding me in a way I desperately needed. What if you keep your response simple? Just confirm you'll be there and that you're looking forward to clearing up any misunderstandings. That's good, Michael agreed. Professional, cooperative, but it also implies that whatever she's heard might not be the whole story. I typed out a brief response, my hands trembling slightly. After showing it to Michael and Rebecca, I hit send and immediately felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I keep thinking about what she might have said, I admitted, setting the phone aside. Carol doesn't just complain about noise anymore. She knows things about my schedule, my habits. What if she told Janet I've been acting paranoid or unstable? What if she describes some of my behavior in a way that sounds concerning? The thought that had been lurking in the back of my mind finally surfaced, and speaking it aloud made it feel terrifyingly real. What if I have been acting strangely? What if trying to avoid her, checking my windows, being careful about noise levels? What if all of that looks like paranoid behavior to someone who doesn't understand the context? Michael's response was immediate and firm. That's exactly what she wants you to think. Sarah, you've been responding rationally to an irrational situation. Everything you've done has been a reasonable attempt to manage an unreasonable person. Rebecca nodded emphatically. You've been walking on eggshells because someone has been monitoring your every move and filing complaints about normal activities. That's not paranoia. That's adaptation to harassment. But the doubt had taken root, and I found myself spiraling into self-examination. I've been so focused on what Carol's doing wrong that I haven't really considered how my reactions might appear to others. When I leave for work 15 minutes earlier to avoid her, when I close my blinds during the day, when I check to see if she's watching before I get my mail, all of that could look like concerning behavior if you don't know why I'm doing it. Stop, Michael said, his voice gentle but authoritative. You're doing exactly what emotional manipulators want their victims to do. You're questioning your own reality and blaming yourself for having normal reactions to abnormal treatment. Rebecca reached for my hand. I've been here for hours now, and I've seen Carol watching your apartment 3 different times. 3 times, Sarah, in one evening. That's not normal neighbor behavior, and your awareness of it isn't paranoia. I wanted to believe them, but the fear was overwhelming. What am I going to tell Janet tomorrow? How do I explain this situation without sounding like I'm making excuses or creating elaborate stories to cover up genuine problems? We're going to prepare for that conversation tonight, Michael said. We'll go through the timeline again, organize the facts, and help you practice explaining the situation clearly and calmly. The idea of practicing the conversation helped, but another thought struck me. What if Carol escalates again between now and Monday morning? What if she calls Janet again tonight or early tomorrow with more complaints? Then Janet will have to consider why someone is making multiple calls about the same person in such a short time frame, Rebecca pointed out. If Carol overplays her hand, it might actually work in your favor. Michael stood up and began pacing, his energy shifting into problem-solving mode. Let's think about this strategically. What does Carol gain by involving your workplace? If her goal is just to make noise complaints, going to your employer doesn't serve that purpose. The question sent a chill through me because I'd been avoiding thinking about Carol's deeper motivations. I don't know. Maybe she thinks getting me fired would force me to move? Maybe she just wants to cause as much disruption to my life as possible? Or maybe she's testing how far she can push this before someone pushes back, Rebecca suggested. People who engage in this kind of behavior often escalate until they meet real resistance. I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me. The constant vigilance, the anxiety about every sound I made, the worry about how my behavior appeared to others. It was all taking a toll I hadn't fully recognized until now. I'm tired, I said, and the admission felt heavier than just physical fatigue. I'm tired of thinking about this, tired of worrying about what she's going to do next, tired of second-guessing every normal thing I do in my own home. Michael stopped pacing and looked at me with concern. That's exactly why we need to address this head-on. You can't live like this indefinitely, and she's clearly not planning to stop on her own. Rebecca squeezed my hand. Tomorrow morning is going to be difficult, but it's also an opportunity. If you can explain the situation clearly to Janet, you might gain an ally instead of losing your job. As we talked, I noticed Carol's apartment lights were still on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow aware of our gathering, planning her next move while we tried to figure out how to respond to her current one. Then my phone buzzed again, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw Janet's name on the screen with another message. With trembling fingers, I opened Janet's message, my stomach churning as Michael and Rebecca leaned closer to see the screen. The blue glow of the phone cast harsh shadows across our faces in the dimly lit living room. "Hi, Sarah. I've been thinking about our conversation today and wanted to check in. Are you doing okay? If you need to talk about anything work-related or personal that might be affecting your performance, my door is always open. See you Monday." The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I actually felt dizzy. I read the message aloud twice, my voice shaking slightly as the words sank in. "That's actually really good," Rebecca said, settling back into the couch cushions. "She's not buying into Carol's narrative completely. Janet's giving you the benefit of the doubt." Michael nodded, running his hand through his hair. "It sounds like she's more concerned about you than suspicious of you." That's the response of a manager who trusts her employee but wants to help if there's a problem. I stared at the message, feeling something shift inside my chest. For the first time since this whole situation started, I felt like someone in a position of authority was treating me like a human being instead of a problem to be managed. The contrast between Janet's thoughtful concern and Carol's relentless hostility was striking. "I should respond, shouldn't I?" I asked, though part of me wanted to savor this moment of feeling supported before diving back into the complexity of explaining my situation. "Keep it simple for now," Michael suggested. "Thank her for checking in, acknowledge that there's a neighbor situation you'd like to discuss, and confirm you'll talk Monday." As I typed a brief response, I became acutely aware of the sounds around us. The gentle hum of my refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, Rebecca's soft breathing as she watched me compose the message. These were the normal sounds of life that Carol had somehow weaponized against me. But sitting here with my brother and best friend, they felt benign again, just background noise in a peaceful evening. After sending the message, I walked to my kitchen window and peered through the blinds toward Carol's apartment. Her lights were still on, and I could see movement behind her curtains. The sight sent a familiar spike of anxiety through me, but it felt different now. Less helpless, more determined. "She's still awake over there," I said, returning to the living room. "I keep wondering what she's thinking, what she's planning next." Rebecca stretched out on the couch, making herself more comfortable. "You know what strikes me about this whole thing? Carol's complaints about your behavior are so vague. Erratic behavior, strange noises, odd hours. If someone was genuinely concerned about a neighbor, wouldn't they be more specific?" The observation hit me with unexpected clarity. "You're right. When I've had legitimate concerns about neighbors before, I could always point to specific incidents. The upstairs neighbor who played music until 3 in the morning, the person who let their dog bark for hours." Michael sat down heavily in my armchair, the one by the window that faced Carol's building. "It's like she's throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. The more general the complaints, the harder they are to refute. And the harder they are to prove," I added, feeling pieces of understanding click into place. If she said I was playing loud music at specific times, Janet could ask me about those incidents directly. But erratic behavior could mean anything or nothing. The realization should have made me feel better, but instead, it highlighted how calculated Carol's approach had been. This wasn't random harassment or momentary frustration with a noisy neighbor. There was strategy behind it, which somehow made it feel more threatening. My phone buzzed again, and all three of us froze. The sound that had become so loaded with dread over the past few days now made my heart race even when I was expecting good news. But this time, it was just a notification from a news app, and I laughed shakily at our collective overreaction. "I need to stop jumping every time my phone makes a sound," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew it would take time to unlearn that response. "Trauma does that," Rebecca said gently. "Even small-scale harassment changes how we react to normal things. It's not weakness, it's just how our minds protect us. The word trauma felt too big for what I was experiencing, but I couldn't deny that something in me had shifted over the past few weeks. I was more vigilant, more suspicious, quicker to interpret neutral events as potentially threatening. The person who used to fall asleep easily was now lying awake listening for sounds that might be misconstrued as problematic. "I want my normal life back," I said, and the admission felt both vulnerable and defiant. "I want to come home from work and not worry about whether closing my door too firmly will generate a complaint. I want to have friends over without calculating whether our conversation might be too loud." "You'll get there," Michael said with quiet conviction. "But first, we need to deal with this head-on instead of just reacting to whatever Carol does next." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a light appeared in Carol's window directly across from where we sat. She was standing there, a silhouette against her bright interior lighting, and she seemed to be looking directly at my apartment. The three of us instinctively went still, like prey animals hoping to avoid detection by remaining motionless. "Is she watching us?" Rebecca whispered, though there was no logical reason Carol could hear us from across the courtyard through closed windows. "I don't know," I whispered back, but something about the way the figure in the window stood there, unmoving, made my skin crawl. "Should I close my blinds?" "No," Michael said firmly, though he kept his voice low. "You live here. You have every right to sit in your own living room with your friends. Don't let her turn you into a prisoner in your own home." But even as he spoke those brave words, all three of us remained frozen on my couch, acutely aware of being observed. The feeling of being watched transformed the familiar space of my living room into something exposed and vulnerable. My own windows, which had always felt like barriers between my private life and the outside world, suddenly felt transparent and insufficient. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the figure moved away from Carol's window, and we collectively exhaled. But the damage was done. The evening's sense of progress and mutual support had been pierced by that simple reminder of how closely we were being monitored. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," I said, frustration building in my voice. "She doesn't even have to do anything now. Just standing in her window changes how I feel in my own home." Michael stood up and walked deliberately to my kitchen, turning on the light and moving around normally. "Then we don't let her. We keep living like normal people because we are normal people." His defiance was admirable, but I noticed he avoided getting too close to the windows. As the evening wound down and Rebecca and Michael prepared to leave, I felt the familiar dread of being alone again in my apartment. Not because I was afraid of Carol doing anything dramatic, but because the hypervigilance was exhausting, and it was harder to maintain perspective without their supportive presence. "Monday's going to be fine," Rebecca said as she gathered her things. "Janet's message proves she's reasonable and willing to listen. And if Carol tries anything else this weekend, document it but don't engage," Michael added. "We're past the point of trying to reason with her." After they left, I sat in my living room as the building settled into its nighttime quiet. Every small sound seemed amplified, and I found myself listening not just to what was happening, but imagining how those sounds might be perceived by someone determined to find fault with everything I did. The refrigerator cycling on, my footsteps across the hardwood floor, the creak of my bed frame as I got ready for sleep, all of it felt potentially problematic in ways that had never occurred to me before Carol entered my life. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my phone buzzed one more time with a text from a number I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold as I read the message, realizing Carol had somehow gotten my personal phone number. With trembling hands, I stared at the unknown number on my phone screen. The message was brief, but chilling. "I know what you're really up to." My heart hammered against my ribs as I screenshot the text before blocking the number. Carol had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. Getting my personal phone number required effort, research, invasion of my privacy in ways that felt far more threatening than her previous complaints. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound from the hallway, every creak of the building settling. When morning finally came, I called Rebecca immediately. "She texted you?" Rebecca's voice was sharp with alarm. "From her personal phone?" "I don't know if it was her phone, or if she got a burner number or what, but who else would it be? The timing is too convenient." I paced around my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, avoiding the windows that faced Carol's apartment. "This changes things. This is harassment, plain and simple. You need to report this to the building management today, not wait until Monday." But when I called the emergency maintenance line, hoping to reach someone in authority over the weekend, I got an automated message directing all non-emergency issues to regular business hours. The weekend stretched ahead of me like a minefield of potential incidents. Michael arrived around noon with groceries, his way of making sure I ate something and didn't isolate myself completely. He found me sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. "Any more messages?" he asked, unpacking fresh fruit and sandwich ingredients. "No, but I keep expecting another one. I keep thinking about how she got my number in the first place. The building has emergency contact information, but that's supposed to be confidential. Did she go through my mail? Did she ask other neighbors?" The possibilities are all unsettling. Michael made us both sandwiches, working methodically while I spiraled through worst-case scenarios. His calm presence helped ground me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he glanced toward Carol's side of the building more frequently than usual. "You know what bothers me most?" I said, accepting the plate he offered. "It's not just that she's making my life difficult. It's that she's making me doubt my own reality. Am I actually doing things that are problematic? Are my footsteps really too loud? Is my music actually disturbing? When someone complains about everything you do, you start questioning whether anything you do is acceptable." "That's exactly what she wants," Michael said firmly. "That self-doubt is the goal. If she can make you police yourself into silence and invisibility, she wins without having to do anything else." As if summoned by our conversation, a deliberate knock echoed through my apartment. 3 sharp raps on the door, authoritative and demanding. Michael and I froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I approached the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. Carol stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, her face set in determined lines. She looked like someone prepared for confrontation, and seeing her there in my doorway felt like a violation of the last safe space I had. "Don't answer it," Michael whispered, but Carol's voice carried clearly through the door. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about your behavior. This has gone on long enough." Her tone was reasonable, almost conversational, which somehow made it more unnerving than if she had been shouting. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door, my heart racing. "I've tried to be patient," Carol continued, speaking to my closed door as if we were having a normal conversation. "I've tried to give you opportunities to correct these issues on your own, but clearly, a direct conversation is necessary." Michael pulled out his phone and started recording, capturing her words through the door. I was grateful for his quick thinking, because my own mind felt frozen with anxiety. "I don't think ignoring me is going to solve anything," Carol said, and I could hear her moving around in the hallway, perhaps trying to listen for sounds from inside my apartment. "I have legitimate concerns about the disruption you're causing, And I think we can resolve this like reasonable adults. The irony of her calling for reasonableness while standing uninvited at my door after sending anonymous threatening texts would have been laughable if it weren't so frightening. We waited in silence for several more minutes until her footsteps finally retreated down the hallway. When I looked through the peephole again, she was gone. But I noticed something white on the floor just outside my door. She left something, I told Michael. Don't open the door yet. Give it a few more minutes. When we finally felt safe enough to retrieve whatever she had left, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. The paper was expensive stationery, and her handwriting was precise and controlled. Since you won't discuss this face-to-face, I'm documenting this interaction for building management and your employer. Your refusal to address legitimate neighbor concerns shows a pattern of antisocial behavior that affects the entire building community. This will be included in my formal complaint. Michael read over my shoulder, his jaw tightening with each word. She's creating a paper trail, he said, making it look like she's been reasonable and you've been uncooperative. The weekend that had started with hope about Monday's meeting with Janet now felt like an endurance test. Carol had escalated from passive-aggressive complaints to active harassment, and I realized that no matter how professional and reasonable I planned to be in Monday's meeting, she was constructing a narrative that painted me as the problem. As evening approached, my phone buzzed with another message from the same unknown number I had blocked. Somehow, she had found another way to reach me. This time, the message was longer and far more threatening. Building management needs to know about your visitors and the disruption they cause. Some people think they can do whatever they want, but there are consequences for antisocial behavior. Michael read the message over my shoulder, and I watched his expression shift from concern to genuine anger. This has gone way beyond neighbor complaints. She's actively trying to intimidate you. I sank onto my couch, feeling the weight of the entire situation pressing down on me. What if she's right about the building management thing? What if she really does have legitimate grounds to complain? About what? Having a friend visit? Living in your own apartment? Michael sat down beside me, his voice firm but gentle. You're letting her get inside your head, and that's exactly what she wants. My phone rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. But when I looked at the screen, it was my sister Emma's name, not another unknown number. I answered with shaking hands. Hey, I was just checking in about your work situation, Emma said. How are you holding up? Actually, it's gotten worse. I found myself spilling everything to her. Carol's escalating behavior, the anonymous texts, tonight's confrontation at my door, and the growing fear that maybe I really was doing something wrong without realizing it. Emma listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she was quiet for a long moment. This woman is systematically trying to destroy your peace of mind, Emma finally said, and there was steel in her voice that reminded me of our mother when someone had hurt one of us as children. She's using psychological manipulation to make you question your own reality. But what if I really am being disruptive? What if there's some truth to what she's saying? Stop! Emma's voice was sharp enough to cut through my spiral of self-doubt. You're the most considerate person I know. You apologize for taking up space in elevators. The idea that you're being disruptive is absurd. Michael nodded emphatically, and I realized how much I had needed to hear that validation from my sister. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Emma continued. Because this isn't going to stop on its own. I have a meeting with my boss Janet on Monday. I'm hoping I can explain the situation and maybe get some protection from future complaints. That's a start, but what about the harassment here at your building? The texts? Showing up at your door? Emma's protective instincts were fully engaged now. "You shouldn't have to live like this." As if summoned by our conversation, another message appeared on my phone. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from Carol directly, using her own contact information, as if she had given up any pretense of anonymity. "Your building lease has clauses about disturbing other residents. Might want to review Section 12 before you find yourself looking for a new place to live." Michael read it and shook his head. "She's not even hiding anymore. She wants you to know it's her." Emma's voice came through the phone, tight with controlled fury. "What did the message say?" I read it to her word for word, and the silence that followed was heavy with implications. Carol wasn't just complaining anymore. She was making threats about my housing, just like she had about my job. "I'm coming over," Emma said suddenly. "I need to see these messages myself, and you shouldn't be dealing with this alone." "Emma, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. This person is threatening my sister's job and now her home. I'm not sitting on the sidelines anymore." After she hung up, Michael and I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, neither of us wanting to turn on too many lights in case Carol was watching from her window across the courtyard. "Your sister's right," Michael said quietly. "This has gone beyond neighbor disputes. Carol is targeting every aspect of your stability: work, housing, peace of mind." That's not accidental. 20 minutes later, Emma arrived with a laptop bag and a determined expression that meant business. She had always been the family problem solver, but I hadn't seen her this focused since she had helped me navigate my divorce 3 years earlier. "Show me everything," she said, settling at my kitchen table. "Every text, every interaction, every complaint. If we're going to stop this, we need to document the pattern." As we laid out the timeline of Carol's escalating behavior, a chilling picture emerged. Each incident had been calculated to seem just reasonable enough on its own, but together, they formed a clear campaign of harassment designed to isolate me and make me question my own judgment. "She's been building a case against you," Emma said, studying the messages. "But she's also created evidence of her own harassment. The question is, who's going to listen?" My phone buzzed again, and this time Carol's message was the most direct yet. My hands trembled as I read Carol's latest message aloud. "Some people never learn when they're not wanted. Maybe a few more calls to your boss will help clarify things." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Emma's face had gone pale in the overhead light, and I watched her fingers tighten around her coffee mug until her knuckles went white. "She's not even pretending this is about noise complaints anymore," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept glancing toward my living room window, as if expecting Carol to materialize there like some vengeful spirit. Emma set down her mug with a sharp clink against the wooden table. "This is psychological warfare. She's trying to make you afraid to exist in your own life." Her laptop screen cast a blue glow across the scattered printouts we had made of every message, every incident, creating a paper trail that looked both substantial and somehow inadequate against the weight of what I was feeling. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, as if Carol's presence across the courtyard was pressing against the walls. Every shadow seemed to hold the possibility of her watching, evaluating, planning her next move. I found myself moving away from the windows without even thinking about it, gravitating toward the inner hallway where no outside eyes could find me. "I keep wondering what I did to trigger this," I said, surprising myself with how small my voice sounded. There had to be something. Some moment where I crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Michael shifted in his chair, the wooden frame creaking under his weight. Stop. You're doing exactly what she wants you to do. Questioning yourself, making this your fault somehow. But the doubts had been growing like weeds in my mind for weeks now. Every interaction I could remember with Carol played on repeat, analyzed and reanalyzed until I couldn't trust my own memories anymore. Had I been too loud that morning when I dropped my keys? Did my laughter with Emma on the balcony last month carry too far? Was my very existence somehow an affront to her sense of order? Emma reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her palm was warm and steady, grounding me back to the present moment. Listen to me. I've known you your entire adult life. You are considerate to a fault. You apologize to furniture when you bump into it. This is not about anything you did. The words should have been comforting, but they only highlighted how powerless I felt. If this wasn't about my behavior, then there was nothing I could change, nothing I could fix. Carol's hostility was like weather, something I simply had to endure. My phone buzzed again, and all three of us froze. The sound that had once been mundane, even welcome, now carried the weight of dread. I stared at the device face down on the table, afraid to turn it over. You don't have to look at it right now, Emma said softly. But the not knowing felt worse than whatever Carol might have written. I flipped the phone over, and my heart sank as I read the message aloud. Talk to your manager today. Such an understanding person. We had a lovely chat about workplace stability. The room tilted slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Carol had called again. While I was sitting here trying to make sense of her previous harassment, she had been actively working to undermine me further. Michael's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly, pacing to the sink and back. This is escalating too fast. She's not just threatening anymore. She's following through. Emma's laptop keys clicked rapidly as she added the new message to her growing documentation. The timing is deliberate. She sent this right after threatening to make more calls. She wants you to know she has follow-through. My kitchen, usually a place of comfort where I made morning coffee and evening tea, now felt like a war room. The cheerful yellow walls that had made me choose this apartment seemed to mock the gravity of what we were facing. Even the small herb garden on my windowsill looked wilted, as if Carol's malevolence was seeping through the glass and poisoning everything it touched. I need to call in sick tomorrow, I said suddenly. The thought of facing my colleagues, wondering who might have spoken to Carol, what she might have said about me, felt overwhelming. I can't walk into that office not knowing what she told them. No. Emma's voice was firm. That's exactly what she wants. She wants you hiding, questioning yourself, giving her power over your choices. But the fear was real and immediate, sitting in my chest like a stone. Every professional relationship I had built felt suddenly fragile, viewed through the lens of whatever narrative Carol was constructing about my character. Michael stopped pacing and turned to face us both. We need to know exactly what she said. You can't fight something if you don't know what you're fighting. The kitchen fell quiet again, except for Emma's continued typing. She was building something, a timeline, a case, a defense, but against what felt like an invisible enemy who could strike from any angle at any time. My phone buzzed once more, and this time Carol's message made my blood run cold. Tomorrow should be an interesting day for you at work. Hope you're ready for some difficult conversations. The silence stretched between us as the weight of Carol's latest threat settled over the kitchen. Emma's fingers had stopped typing, and even Michael had ceased his restless pacing. The cheerful hum of my refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. She's trying to control the narrative before you even know what story she's telling, Emma said finally, closing her laptop with a decisive snap. But we're not going to let her have that power. I stared at my phone, reading Carol's message over and over. The casual cruelty of it, the obvious pleasure she took in my anticipated discomfort, made my stomach churn. How do I walk into work tomorrow, not knowing what landmines are waiting for me? Michael returned to his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The same way you've walked in every other day for the past 3 years. You know who you are. Your coworkers know who you are. One conversation with a manipulative neighbor doesn't erase that. But doubt crept in anyway, seeping through the cracks in my confidence like water through a damaged foundation. What if she told them I was having some kind of breakdown? What if she made me sound unstable? Then you show them the opposite, Emma said firmly. You go in there tomorrow, you do your job well, and you handle whatever comes up with grace and professionalism. That's who you are, and that's what they'll see. The logical part of my mind knew they were right, but the anxious part kept spinning scenarios. What if my manager had already made up his mind about me? What if Carol's concerns seemed reasonable to someone who didn't know her true nature? Michael reached across the table and touched my hand. Remember what we talked about earlier? About not letting her live in your head rent-free? This is exactly what that looks like. His words cut through the spiral of worry, bringing me back to the present moment. I looked around my kitchen at these two people who had dropped everything to help me navigate this bizarre situation. Emma, with her methodical approach and fierce loyalty. Michael, with his steady presence and refusal to let me face this alone. You're right, I said, taking a deep breath. I'm giving her exactly the reaction she wants. Emma reopened her laptop, her expression determined. Let's use this time productively. If she's escalating her contact with your workplace, we need to be prepared. Tell me everything about your work relationships, your manager's personality, how your company typically handles outside complaints. As I began describing my workplace dynamics, I felt some of the panic recede. This was actionable information, something we could work with rather than simply worry about. My manager, David, is pretty level-headed, I explained. He's not the type to make snap judgments. If Carol called him, he'd probably want to hear my side before drawing any conclusions. Michael nodded approvingly. That works in your favor. Reasonable people can usually spot unreasonable behavior, even when it's dressed up as concern. Emma typed notes as I spoke. What about HR? Do you have a good relationship there? Sarah in HR has always been supportive. We've worked together on several projects. I felt a small spark of confidence returning. Actually, now that I think about it, she's dealt with difficult situations before. She knows how to separate legitimate concerns from personal vendettas. See? Emma looked up from her screen. You're not as isolated as Carol wants you to feel. You have allies, people who know your character and work ethic. The kitchen felt less like a war room now, and more like a planning session among trusted friends. My phone sat silent on the table. Carol's threatening message no longer the terrifying specter it had seemed moments before. Michael glanced at the clock on my wall. It's getting late, but I think we've got a solid foundation here. You go to work tomorrow, you handle whatever comes up professionally, and you document everything. And if anyone asks about Carol's call? I asked. Emma's smile had a sharp edge. You tell them the truth, that you have a neighbor who's been harassing you, and you're dealing with it through appropriate channels. Simple, straightforward, and it puts the focus back where it belongs. I felt something shift inside me, a straightening of my spine that had been bent under the weight of Carol's psychological warfare. You know what? I'm actually looking forward to tomorrow now. Not because I want confrontation, but because I'm tired of being afraid of her. There's the spirit we've been waiting to see, Michael said, with genuine pride in his voice. Emma saved her work and closed the laptop again. Carol made a tactical error tonight. She showed her hand too clearly. The timeline we've built shows a pattern of escalation that any reasonable person would recognize as harassment. As my friends prepared to leave, I walked them to the door, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The apartment that had felt invaded by Carol's presence now seemed like home again. Thank you, I said simply. Both of you. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you. Emma hugged me tightly. That's what friends do. We face the crazy neighbors together. After they left, I stood in my kitchen looking out the window toward Carol's house. The lights were on in her living room, and I could see her silhouette moving about. But instead of the anxiety that sight usually provoked, I felt something closer to pity. Tomorrow would indeed be an interesting day, but not in the way Carol expected. I was ready for whatever conversation awaited me, armed with the truth and surrounded by people who knew my character. Carol's power over me was finally broken, not by fighting fire with fire, but by refusing to let her chaos become my own.